Hello, I'm Jim Slaven, and this is All Hail to the Pod. This year marks the 150th anniversary of James Connolly's birth in the Cowgate. Connolly 150, a standalone project to celebrate his life, has organised dozens of events throughout the year, featuring politics, poetry, theatre, music and sports. We held a conference on Connolly's life with leading Connolly scholars from across the globe. We had a commemoration with 16 members of James Connolly's family who had travelled from around the world. We held an international concert and an outreach programme which held dozens of sessions, mainly in working class communities, and an arts exhibition called Connolly Lives as part of the Edinburgh International Festival. All of this was done with zero funding for the state, for unions or from political parties. Connolly 150 was funded by, led by and organised by the working class. All of these events throughout the year received zero media coverage. The media are quick to cover negative stories about the working class, but seem to have no interest in covering positive examples of working class self-organisation like Connolly 150. This has been a hugely enjoyable, rewarding and successful project, and in the coming months it will be up to us to tell that story fully. A constant throughout all the different activities that will be organised has been an attempt to encourage a deeper, more meaningful engagement with Connolly's writings and ideas. So we were delighted to support Haymarket Books in launching their James Connolly Reader. Before the launch event in Lighthouse Books in Edinburgh, I sat down with the editor, Shaun Harkin, to discuss James Connolly, his life and his relevance. Shaun, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
I think we should begin, Shaun, maybe give us a wee bit about your background, how we've got to here, how you came to Connolly, sure, and how you've came to edit this James Connolly Reader.
Sure, yeah. Well, I grew up in Derry and left when I was 19 and went to university in the US. I got recruited to play football. I was a bit of a footballer when I was younger. And then when I was living in the US, I got more and more involved in political activism and got when I finished university, I was consulted for a union, tried to organise the Marriott Hotel in Providence, and then I ended up in the Teamsters Union at UPS. And in part, I kind of that was my route to discovering a bit more about James Connolly, because obviously growing up in Derry, I knew James Connolly had been a leader of the Rising. I knew he'd been executed, he was a martyr, but I didn't really know too much more than that. And I was at a Labour Notes conference, and somebody in a conversation about James Connolly handed me the pamphlet that he wrote when he was in the US, Socialism Made Easy. And I think that opened my eyes in terms of Connolly didn't just have something to say about Ireland, he had something to say about the US and about trade unionism and about connecting all that up with socialism. So that sparked a deeper interest for me about James Connolly's politics. When it was coming up to the 100th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, the folks at Haymarket and I had a conversation about doing a reader about James Connolly, or producing a collection of his works. So the original aim was to produce it for 2016, and then for one reason or another, all good reasons because of activism getting in the way, we ended up deciding to wait until the 150th anniversary. And that worked out better, I think, because there was lots of great books produced and events held to mark the anniversary of the Rising. But I think Connolly would have been somewhat lost in it. And I think doing events now, like yourself, it brings about much more attention to Connolly and actually what Connolly stood for, what he argued, and really to talk about his relevance for today. So that's how we kind of decided to do it. And, it was personally to be able to take the time to read through as much as I could of Connolly's writings, and I didn't get to read them all, and to read what other people have written about Connolly and how they've interpreted him. It was very, very useful. It was a good experience. So my recommendation for people, if they're interested in finding out about James Connolly or understanding him, is, of course, I encourage people to pick up a copy of the James Connolly Reader. But You can go and read James Connolly on the internet. You can go to Marxist.org, and there's a fantastic collection of Connolly's writings there. And I think even people who know a bit about James Connolly, I think, are often surprised at the breadth of his writing and how many issues he kind of tackled and how he thought about a whole range of questions.
I think the first thing to say is I've read The Reader. It's a fantastic achievement, so congratulations on that. And I think it's really important, as you say, that people read Connolly, and whether that's through The Reader or whether it's some other source, but to read Connolly himself is a very rewarding experience, and he's incredibly relevant, and we can come on to that in a minute. Also, that coming to Connolly through the Rising is something very familiar with myself as well. That would be in terms of the Irish community in Scotland. Connolly would be known as somebody who's like in the pantheon of Irish national martyrs, right next to Padraig Pearse's Zeus. And it's only later that we come to a deeper understanding of his whole life. And you've also, in The Reader, wrote an excellent introduction to Connolly. So maybe could you maybe just outline that as well, just his life? For here, we're sitting in Cowgate HQ.
Sure.
We could, and then how he went to the States and that as well.
Yeah. Well, I think in writing an introduction, right, I was trying to avoid me telling the reader, or this is what James Connolly thought. But part of the challenge, I think, in terms of introducing James Connolly is that he has been interpreted by everybody, because everybody can kind of claim some of James Connolly because he addressed so many questions. And then the other problem is that I think the main challenge for radicals is that Connolly's radical legacy has been buried, or there was an attempt to obscure it, to bury it. So how do you actually draw that out? And I think that what I try to do in the introduction is it's a chronological introduction, and the texts that are included in The Reader are also chronological. And what that does is you can kind of say, this is what Connolly was doing at that time. This is what he wrote about it. And so you can actually draw out the connections. So whether it's how Connolly thought about his participation in the Rising, which was unique in some ways in terms of the other leaders of the Rising, but it allows you to actually say, this is how he was thinking, this is how it's connected to what he was doing. And I think that's what I attempted to do in the introduction. And yeah, so, but I think that Connolly led a pretty interesting life, in terms of what you get to do in your life, because he lived in a number of places. And if you think about, this is a guy who grew up here, obviously in Cowgate, and started at the bottom rung of society in terms of, he had very little in terms of opportunities. He was out working, as you know, from a very young age, from 8 years old. His family were impoverished. They were refugees from the Great Hunger. And they found themselves with, the other 80,000 Irish people who managed to get here as a result of the famine. And so there was a real struggle. And of course, we walked past St. Patrick's today, but Connolly finished formal education for Connolly, and it ended at a very, very young age. So the fact that he was able to make such great theoretical and political and then even strategic contributions, where it shows his ability to think in his feet, I think he's a great example of what all working class people can kind of aspire to, whether or not they've had formal education or whether or not you go to university. So I think he is, he was a fantastic exemplary rebel, but he also, I think, speaks to the potential of the working classes. And of course, so many working class people think that what they think, what they do, doesn't really matter, because it's the important people that make decisions. And we're always taught, from a very young age that there's other people in power, the experts, the professionals, and that they're going to be the best placed people to actually address the issues in society. And we know that that's not true. So I think that's a fundamentally important thing about James Connolly, his background. And I think because he grew up impoverished, part of the working class, he understood the needs of the working class. It was his class, so he wasn't thinking about the working class from above or from far off. He was very intimately involved. He knew what he needed himself. He knew what his own family needed. And I think, when you think about his entire life, he never escaped poverty. And he was very much looking at the society from the point of view of the downtrodden, the dispossessed, the disinherited, as he said, or the mob. That was his worldview, and I think he gave expression to what working class people, the best aspirations that working class people could have about, their anger and their desire for change. So, I think that in and of itself is a very, very important part of it. And then, of course, he ends up in the British military, and I think a lot of people are kind of shocked to hear that Connolly spent 7 years in the military. I had no idea, and it changes the way you think about Connolly, somewhat. That when you think about the struggle in Ireland, and the British soldiers are on one side, of course, the legacy from the Troubles, and the idea that here's somebody who's a martyr to the Irish struggle for self-determination, but he actually, the first time he seen Ireland was in the uniform of a British private. So, obviously Connolly nor his brother joined the British military for ideological reasons, as most people don't join for ideological reasons. But it was poverty that recruited James Connolly to the British military. And I'm sure his time in Ireland, he doesn't write about it, but you have to assume that he was sent out to deal with sectarian violence. There was the land war was going on. So Connolly would have seen all that firsthand. And I think it would have deepened his understanding of Irish politics. And I'm sure he already had a good grasp on it, given he grew up in an Irish community. But there's no doubt, from 14 years on, he was learning that and really helped his political development. I think he also learned a lot about the role of the military and what soldiers are asked to do. And he talks about soldiers being, the hired assassin, that they're not asked to think. They're discouraged from thinking. The whole point is obey orders even when you know it's wrong, because you're not human being. You're cannon fodder for something much bigger. So he when he does write about the military, he writes about it with a tremendous amount of anger, because it was his own personal experience. But I also think he writes about it with some compassion as well, for the fact that he understands that it's economic conscription that drives people into the military. But I think it's a great vision, to think about a former imperial soldier becoming the leader of a anti-colonial rebellion. And I think we should hope that can inspire other soldiers who are in the British Army, or who are in the German Army, or who are in the American Army, or in the Australian Army, that's something that they could actually aspire to, given through their own experiences. So Connolly's experience, I think that Connolly, the participation in the army had a big impact on him. Obviously, it helped him in terms of thinking strategically about what war means and about how to conduct a struggle as well. And then he goes AWOL from the army, and there's different, from what I read in terms of what's historically available, there was some suggestion that his unit might be going to India, some suggestion it might be going to England, but he goes AWOL, and of course that's one of the reasons I think he doesn't talk a lot about his military service, because if the authorities are looking for you, there's no point telling them that I was in the army, and I decided to leave. And then I think the other reason he probably didn't talk about it much, given that he was organising in primarily working class Irish areas, it could have undermined him that you used to be a soldier. You can understand that for all those reasons, he probably didn't want to talk about it too much.
And it's interesting, you mentioned his brother John. His brother John is actually buried in Edinburgh, and he died a few weeks after Connolly, and the British Army execute Connolly, and then a few weeks later give his brother a full military funeral, and he's listed on a war memorial in Edinburgh as well. So it's interesting, the connections there in terms of within the community, as you say, people from an Irish community with a deep affinity with Ireland and Ireland's national struggle, but yet some of them at a young age find themselves in the British Army in Ireland. And also I'm interested in this idea of Connolly's development. and his political development throughout his life. Because, as we say, people often come to Connolly through the end of his life, through his involvement in the Rising and his execution. But actually, for me, what's interesting is how we can see, and we see it in the chronology that you've set out there, that Connolly's political development begins here in Edinburgh, and his political activism here in the 1890s, and then he goes to Ireland. But also, given that you came to Connolly in a sort of deeper way in the United States, what about Connolly in the United States? He's got a really important role over there with people like Eugene Debs. Can you say a bit about that? Because I think that's really fascinating, that connection with Debs and his involvement with the IWW.
Yeah, well, just on Connolly in Edinburgh, I mean, Connolly became a revolutionary in Scotland, and I think, you know, he's very much a Scottish revolutionary and a son of Edinburgh or a son of Scotland. I think people should celebrate that, and I think that's why it's been great that there's been so much happening over the last year to mark his 150th anniversary. It's just and it's right that should happen, and maybe out of all the events that have been held, more people will begin to see him as a very relevant figure or an iconic figure for the socialist movement, the labour movement, people who want to see social justice. And similarly with the US as well. You know, it's interesting that there's more statues of James Connolly in the US than there are here in Ireland or in Scotland. There's a statue to Connolly in Troy, New York. There's a statue to Connolly in Chicago. And yeah, he spent 7 years there. He went there in 1902. He got recruited by a socialist party. They initially asked him to write a leaflet that they would distribute to Irish migrants or Irish American workers. The socialist movement was trying to relate its ideas to the massive numbers of migrants that had moved out of the US in the preceding decades. So that Connolly wrote a pamphlet and they distributed 60,000 copies of it. And then they followed that up with an invite for him to come out and do a tour. And I think there was a couple of reasons why Connolly was interested in doing that. One, I think he was interested in seeing what the socialist movement looked like in the United States, you know, the capitalist country, the country of individualism. I think he was interested in getting in contact with the Irish community living in the US. There was also real financial problems and this was a constant. You know, Connolly was promised a regular wage by the Dublin Socialists when he first went there. That didn't materialise very often. So the Irish Socialist Republican Party that he had founded didn't have a lot of funds, and we know what that's like for much of his. And this was a way, in some ways, to kind of promote the project that Connolly was involved in Ireland. And to raise funds to kind of sustain the party, but because Connolly was so bound up with the party in the sense that his income was dependent on that as well, I think so there was a number of reasons why I think Connolly went out there. But the tie with the American socialists was because there was also a debate in the broader international socialist movement. And Connolly came down on it on the same side as the American socialists. Now, that was a debate at the time about whether or not the French socialists should go into a government that was a capitalist or bourgeois government, as they called it, and whether it would be useful or whether it could advance the cause of socialism. And Connolly was hard against this. He thought that it would lead to the co-option of the socialist movement, and it would lead to the corruption of the socialist movement, and he campaigned against it, as did the Americans. So I think that they very much seen themselves as the you know, defending the revolutionary legacy of Karl Marx and others. And I think, you know, the history of the last 100 years of socialism, I think that division between revolution and reformism, I think, is very much there, and it's clear which side Connolly came down on. So he moves. As a result of going out there, I think it opened his eyes to what existed in the US, and then some of the political troubles, the financial political troubles, but I think also some of the debates that were in the socialist movement in Ireland led Connolly to conclude that he needed a change of scenery. He now had a family, and so he goes to the United States in 1903, and this is a more permanent move. And I think for a lot of people who left Ireland back in those days, once you left, that you were usually gone. unless you became very wealthy and you could afford to come back with your new wealth. So I think he probably at that time seen it as a final departure from Ireland, and he had very much fallen in love with Ireland. I mean, he talks about how much he loved being in Ireland and seen it as his primary home. But nevertheless, he ends up out there in 1903, and he throws himself immediately into the socialist movement. He has some debates with the Socialist Party that he joins, and I think that this gives you another insight into Connolly, because one of the criticisms that he made about the American socialist movement, he thought that they were creating unnecessary barriers to migrant workers who were open to socialism but maybe also had some religious ideas. And Connolly argued, look, you don't need to have broken from religion in order to be a socialist. People can be socialists and still have faith, and we shouldn't impose this as otherwise there'll be very few people joining the socialist movement or the trade union movement. And so he had this debate, and I think he was right about it. And I think Connolly had that insight because he grew up amongst working class people who identified with Catholicism, and it wasn't just a matter of faith; it was also to do with the fact that part of their experience as part of the British colonization was about destroying the Catholic identity, eradicating the Irish language. So I think Connolly had a good understanding of how people can develop radical ideas and become revolutionaries, and that the church might not be a barrier to it.
I think that's interesting because obviously Connolly and religion is one of these things that's debated, and he wrote a lot about it himself, but people often reduce it to, did he take confession near his death, or it's about Connolly himself. Was he a Catholic? Was he a practicing Catholic? Whereas actually what it's about, it's clear from what you're saying there, that this is about revolutionary strategy, and it's about him viewing himself as a revolutionist and thinking we need to adopt a position on religion which enables people to come into the movement to build a working class movement. And so he was critical of the church and the organisation of the church, rather than being critical of people who were practicing Catholics, which a lot of the left at the time were. And I think that does come from the root of the community that he comes from in the Cowgate as well, where the St Patrick's Church played a crucial role as a hub of the community. It was much more than just the religion. Do you think that's right, or is it more about Connolly himself?
No, I think that the way that you're describing it is right. I think that he thought about the relationship between religion and the project of revolution, and I think he realised that thinking that the idea that people would have to abandon religion in order to join the struggle for social change would be a utopian thing. We'd be waiting forever because there's many good reasons why people believe that the next world will be better, or that religion in some ways is a comforting thing. And then, as you said, when there's little of a welfare state, the church has often played the role of a charitable institution, or it's where you go to get help. So I think that Connolly's approach to that, there's a lot we can actually learn from it, because I think it's the right approach. When you think about Martin Luther King and the way that he interpreted religion, it really depends how you interpret religion and how you use it. It can be used for reactionary ends, as we know. I mean, Donald Trump has of course now become religious all of a sudden. But then there's you can all, and I think what Connolly tried to do with religion is appeal to the best aspects of Christianity or Catholicism, which is about justice, equality, and draw them out. And I think then in his debates with the actual Catholic Church, or the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, he was basically saying these people profess to be in favour of all equality, and it's very clear that having great wealth is criticised from a Christian point of view. But the reality is the church hierarchy has opposed every rebellious movement in Ireland for hundreds of years. They never seem to side with the workers. They never seem to side with the downtrodden. They want to lecture to them on a Sunday, but then constantly we find that the church officials are siding with the great and the powerful. And I think that was that was a way for Connolly to actually speak to working class Catholics, working class Protestants about the contradictions that existed without demanding of them that they give up faith before they could enter into the struggle. And then when it comes to Connolly himself, that's when it gets a little bit more complex, because he does write to one of his comrades. He says, "Look, I've posed as as someone who's religious for 15 years. I don't have a tincture of faith." Now, this is when he's being very, very open to a close comrade. But he didn't want to present himself as somebody who was just anti-religious or who was opposed to religion, because I think he understood as well that the church, the Catholic Church, that was a critic of the socialist movement, that was opposed to the socialist movement, wanted to place Connolly and the socialist movement as some sort of exotic, campaign that was somehow disconnected from the lives of working class people. So I see Connolly as somebody, and then, in his major writings about religion as well, he talks about, that the church attempts to lay out an understanding of history, but he argues that Karl Marx's historical materialism, if you want to call it that, that approach to understanding history is the best way to understand history. So he goes out of his way to defend it, without thinking that this is going to become the way that the vast majority of people think about the world. And then, it gets more complex then in his dying moments, because obviously there's a priest who visits Connolly who claims that Connolly did a confession. Maybe he did. And there could be practical or political reasons for that once again. But he was badly injured. He had a lot of morphine. I think too, Connolly was probably worried about Lily, his partner, and his family, because who would take care of them? A revolutionary who was now, going to be an outcast. And we know that the Catholic Church was one of the institutions that did offer help to people. So there might have been very, very practical reasons. But I don't think it really changes the fact that, because the point that for the people who wanted to play down or emphasize Connolly's Catholicism or attachment to the church, it was about saying he wasn't really that radical. He wasn't a radical on his deathbed, and it narrows Connolly's politics down to something that is acceptable for the rulers of the new free state who had nothing to do with the kind of vision that Connolly stood for. So I think it doesn't change anything about Connolly spent his life, as we know, fighting to get rid of capitalism, fighting for the uplift of the working classes. And I think that whatever complexity exists about his own personal relationship to the church, I think that's still, the main body of work of Connolly, I think, stands up for where he was coming from.
And you mentioned his wife Lily there as well. And one of the issues that he fell out with De Leon in the States was over women's rights and women's place within the socialist movement. Connolly, through his life, was a very strong feminist, very strong on women's rights. And I think you can see that right through his relationship with his wife Lily. That's the starting point for it. But do you want to just say a bit about that and about his support for suffragettes? And I mean, it really was a very strong commitment he had, which was really unusual, even in the left then.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is something that I discovered myself, because there was quite a few comrades who were very experienced comrades who said Connolly wasn't very good on women's rights. And it wasn't really until you read more about the struggles that Connolly supported, and then some of his own writings on the rights of women. So yeah, Connolly was a supporter of the suffragette movement. He didn't just, again, support it in a kind of far off way or from the sidelines. He actively encouraged women to join the suffragette movement, backed them up when they were using very, very militant tactics, and defended women's right to full participation in society. And I think that, he was really in advance of a lot of the left, because we're talking now, women are still fighting for full equality today, but 100 years ago it was a lot worse. Society was far more conservative, and so Connolly, I think, I think he has a chapter in the Reconquest of Ireland, which was one of his later writings. He wrote that in 1915, and I think it's a brilliant chapter about where he explains what women have faced in Ireland for hundreds of years. Inequality, oppression, and then he celebrates the fact that women now are in rebellion and are demanding equality of sex, and are basically out at the front of the movement fighting for social change, whether that was suffrage, whether that was the right to be in a trade union. And of course his argument was that this struggle in and of itself is good, but it's also good for the overall working class struggle because it can inspire other sections of the workers to fight back as well. And as we know, women are half the working class population, so that is going to have an impact. And he makes a couple of arguments as well about it's up to women to decide what a fetter is. So women have decided that these things are things that hold them back from participation in society. So we should back their struggle to undo those fetters, and that and the entire working class should get behind those struggles. So yeah, I think a lot of people are surprised that Connolly was described by the leading feminists of his day as a great feminist. The fact that he was being described as a feminist, over 100 years ago, I think is a credit to Connolly. But it's also an important legacy of the socialist movement that Connolly was part of.
And just to reaffirm the point you're making there, just this week in Glasgow we've seen thousands of women striking for equal pay in the city, and the unions still fighting for the women to get equal pay, and this is all these years after we're talking about Connolly. But that also connects to something else I want to speak about. Connolly come back from the United States, very much involved with IWW, but also with that idea he'd one big union, and so it's a very particular idea of unions, different than we would maybe understand today. You want to just explain maybe the IWW, Debs, and that influence on his thinking that he then brought back to for the Great Lockout? Sure,
yeah. I mean, I think that Connolly's time in America had a big impact on him, and one of the I think what he learned about the trade union movement and what he participated in the US was one of the biggest impacts on him. So he joined. A new organisation was formed in 1905 in the US. It brought together some of the best radical traditions. So the United Mine Workers Federation, Eugene Debs, Mather Jones, Connolly, the number of different socialist parties and kind of syndicalists, people from what had been the more conservative trade union movement, all joined because they had become very frustrated at the limitations and the conservatism of the American Federation of Labour, which was essentially there had been big struggles to form the unions that made up the American Federation of Labour, the AFL, but it had essentially become a craft union, and it didn't see its duty as organising the unskilled workers, the casual workers, the precarious workers, as we would call them today. And the IWW made it its mission to organise all workers, no matter their creed, the colour of their skin, no matter their sex. And of course you can see why Connolly would be attracted to that. So this was a union that in its preamble said that there is two classes in society, and we're out to overthrow the system and to bring about a new industrial workers' republic. And so this very much fitted with Connolly's vision that he had put forward for Ireland of a socialist workers' republic, and I think that the type of activism that the IWW encouraged was about creating a culture of solidarity and a culture of struggle within the working classes. It didn't see its duty simply to negotiate better terms and conditions, which were important, of course. They were fighting over wages, they were fighting over the number of hours that were worked, they were fighting over sick pay, all those very, very practical things that matter in a day-to-day way. But they were also trying to say, look, we have to have a vision of something much bigger, and this is where the revolutionary project of the trade union movement was very important. Now, the the Wobblies were inspired by a big struggle somewhere else as well, and that was the 1905 mass strikes in Russia. And I think that if you think about some of the debates that existed in the socialist movement and how they played into this, the socialist movement had grown by this period in different parts of the world, especially Germany. Even the US was seeing a bigger socialist movement, but the emphasis had become about building up your socialist party and getting as many votes as possible in order to get more socialist parliamentarians or socialist officials elected. And then these, once you had a big enough bloc, you could become the government and institute change. And so this became a very top-down way of thinking about social change, because what it did is it shifted agency away from the working class to, the people above, the experts, the professionals. And this is something I think Connolly rejected. I think it was connected to that debate about whether or not socialists should go into as a minority partner into a pro-capitalist government. So I think Connolly seen the drift towards a top-down version of socialism. So the IWW was very much about seeing the struggles of the working class from the workplace up, the working class communities. That's the beating heart of socialism. It's going to be up to what workers do themselves, so getting into struggles, whether they're defeated or not, are all important in terms of what the working class learns, how it trains fighters, how more socialists are developed. So, and Connolly then, of course, brings the experience of being a wobbly organiser back to Ireland, and he joins up with Jim Larkin and the Transport Workers Union, who very much have developed that kind of syndicalist vision as well of building one big union that can unite the working class, but also encouraging that spirit of solidarity. And that this is a forward moving struggle, and that we have an end goal, which is really the liberation of the working classes.
And of course, after we have you've got the lockout. Then is a big major. Maybe we should just say something about the lockout in particular, which is one of the major labour struggles, battles between capital and labour that happened early in the 20th century, where there was maybe a lot of other activities and strikes happening, but the lockout was a particularly important struggle for workers. Yeah,
I mean, the lockout. There's a lot about the lockout that's been written. That's very, very important, and I think people. It's still probably the most important labour struggle that's happened in Irish history, and I think the heroism of the Dublin working class, the fact that they were brutalised, they were starved, and it took all that to try and break them, and so I think it's for any trade union leader, I think it's the highest point of struggle, and there's a lot of lessons. But there's a couple of other things I think about the struggle in terms of why Connolly thought it was so important. And this was something I discovered just by when I had the opportunity to kind of think about what he was saying about the Dublin lockout. Because again, and I think it's relevant today as well. So this was the time when Home Rule was being debated. And Connolly did assume, maybe too optimistically, that Home Rule was going to become a reality for Ireland. This was the presumption, I think, about most of the political people in Ireland. It had been passed in the House of Commons. This battle had happened now. This was the third Home Rule bill. It seemed like the arrangement of the British government was agreeing to it, and that that even unionist opposition wouldn't be enough to stop Home Rule from becoming a reality. And so on the back of that, Connolly formed the Irish Labour Party, or attempted to form the Irish Labour Party, because he was envisioning there will be now an opportunity to have an all-Ireland Labour Party, and we want both the socialists but other people who see themselves as wanting the working class represented in this new Home Rule Parliament. And of course, and the Dublin lockout happens in the midst of that. So you have this militant revolutionary union that is going from strength to strength in some ways. It goes from the Belfast lockout, the Belfast dock strike, where Protestant and Catholic workers managed to overcome sectarian divisions to fight together and have a big, big victory. And I think for the unionist elites and for the employers in general, that's a terrifying prospect, that a union has managed to find a way of bringing workers in such a sectarianised city together. And of course then the growth of the transport workers continues, because they're able to go and say across Ireland, if we organise and fight, we can actually change things. And so things come to a head in 1913, where the employer class, and this includes of course the nationalist elite and the unionist elite, where they begin to see what the direction of travel. So you have a growing union that is not just interested in negotiating better terms and conditions, but they're talking about independence for Ireland, establishing a workers' republic, and it's got it's gaining the confidence and growing numbers of members, and there's the strategies that the union is employing of strikes, direct action, secondary strikes, pickets. They don't allow the laws and the legal system to obstruct the type of struggles that they want to pursue. I think this is terrifying for the employers. But then if you think about it again on the level of what's this new Home Rule Ireland going to look like, because I think that there's a whole elite that's hoping reduced British influence in Ireland will be great for us, because we will get to determine how the economy grows. We will reap more profits from an Ireland that will hopefully develop more industrially. And so getting in the way of this vision that they have is this union coming up saying, we have a vision for Ireland as well, and it's about the working classes actually getting to decide what happens. It's about not having a system based on profit, and it's about the sharing of the wealth. And I think this is why the employers united in Dublin to basically say this union has to be smashed, and that's why the struggle became so intense. So it wasn't, as Connolly said, this wasn't just a labour battle. This was about the future of Ireland. It was about who was going to dominate Ireland, which class was going to rule. And I think then you see the potential. When the strike does get a response in Britain, in England and Scotland, where there are strikes in support of the transport workers, and then there's also lots of aid coming across. There's pressure on trade union leaders across the water to do more. You can see how it's not just a struggle about Ireland, it's about how it can impact across the water as well. So I think for all these reasons, the British state, the employers in Britain, employers across Ireland, the elites really in Ireland and in Britain were terrified of the project that the Transport Workers Union had set out. And of course, the struggle could have won. The trade union leaders in Britain, but also some trade union leaders in Ireland, didn't see themselves as revolutionaries out to overthrow Ireland. They seen themselves as their role as negotiating a better life for workers under capitalism. So they didn't want to see this revolutionary trade unionism grow either. But I think for us today, I think that as we think about where Ireland's heading in the next 5-10 years, I think that struggle becomes particularly important. And also when we're in an age of austerity where everything that we've won in the past is being taken away, and people ask how are we going to turn this around, I think the strategies and tactics that Connolly and Larkin pursued are the types of strategies we need, we desperately need today.
And the lockout is certainly one of the major staging posts on the road to the rising. The other one being the following year of the outbreak of World War One. And some of Connolly's best writing is anti-war writing. His writing against the First World War is incredibly relevant to us today, but for the time was way ahead of everybody else in the sense of his understanding of the industrial nature of the conflict and how terrible it was going to be for everyone involved, particularly for the working class. So in the context of World War One and the defeat of the lockout, we have these to rising. Now, a lot of people, there's always a debate about Connolly, was his involvement in the rising an anathema to socialism and what happened there, what have you. To me, it's a culmination of all of that development, all of that experience that he had gained in the revolutionary movements that he'd been involved in throughout the world. What's your own take of that in the sense of Connolly's involvement in the rising and how that came about in the context of the First World War?
Well, I think that first of all we have to defend the rising. it was an anti-imperialist rising, an anti-war rising, and it was also an attempt to end British domination of Ireland and establish an independent Ireland. And I think that that's the first thing. I think then we should defend Connolly's participation in the rising, but then that's, I think, part of the iconography that's developed around Connolly as well, where he's been narrowed in so that his participation in the rising is seen, you know, did he die for the cause of Ireland? What's the cause of Ireland? Was this a blood sacrifice? And I think that in popular culture, this is often what people kind of think. I mean, I thought that. Lots of other people would have thought it as well. But I think if you go back to 1914, and then if you think about Connolly's politics more generally, I mean, Connolly had written for a long time about the nature of modern wars, that this was about capitalism. The Marxist movement had developed the theory of imperialism to understand how the big states would go to war over carving up the planet, and that everywhere else would be a victim in that war. And of course, Ireland as a colonised nation was sucked into this because, of course, Britain, to conduct its war efforts in the First World War, wanted troops from Ireland and so on. So I think Connolly seen himself as part of the international socialist movement, and I think it was devastating for Connolly when the war broke out to have the international socialist movement kind of collapse and not fulfill the resolutions that it had passed years and years earlier, which was to do everything in its power to stop the outbreak of a war. And that included, and Connolly writes about this, he says it's our duty to, it should be the duty of socialists right now to, organise mass demonstrations, to organise general strikes, to blow up bridges, and if necessary, start a civil war. Because the consequences of a civil war that's about a working class trying to take on its own rulers, whatever number of people are killed and injured it'll be a lot less than the slaughter that we're about to see between these warring big powers. And of course, he was absolutely right. I mean, and this is why he did talk about this is a war that will potentially destroy civilization. And I think he meant both human beings and the cities and everything else that human labour had created. This would be the first industrial war. And so when others kind of faltered or collapsed into support for the war and the passivity, Connolly was sticking to a revolutionary project, and he was trying to figure out, what do we do in Ireland? And he was somewhat isolated, because it wasn't the case that the entire Irish socialist movement was united behind opposing the British war effort and opposing the war more generally. There were socialists who were for the union with Britain, who believed that it was the duty of socialists to back the British war effort. And of course, so these were all challenges that Connolly had to face. And I think in that period too, he in 1914, he develops a perspective. And I think it's really important to draw this out, because you can't really understand his participation in 1916 without it, when he argues that a rising in Ireland can actually, this is an opportunity when Britain is stretched to strike for Irish independence, and of course for Connolly, in striking for Irish independence, all would open the door to the struggle for a socialist workers' republic. But he thought beyond Ireland as well, because he wrote about, at the same time, he said this could be a struggle in Ireland, or a rising in Ireland can actually spark a European-wide upheaval against the war and against capitalism. And he also understood that, because he could see it happening in Ireland, there was the early enthusiasm for the war, right? And it was true in Britain, and it was true across Europe. But that would wane. It would wane because of the profiteering of the munitions companies, the corruption that's involved there, the death that went on, and the contradictions of the war. So by 1915, Connolly was arguing that Europe is ripe for revolution, and that what was needed now to move things forward was action to move it forward. And then the rising itself, of course, I don't think Connolly for a minute thought that this was ever going to be about theatre, as in a blood sacrifice. And I think I actually think the other leaders of the Rising are done down as well in terms of their radicalism is narrowed in as well. But I think, if they thought that they could mobilise 15,000 people, which was a minority of the Irish volunteers, still a large number of people, and of course weapons that were coming from Germany. So there was a real plan for an uprising that you can imagine being successful in a country where the British presence in Ireland had been reduced because of what it was trying to carry out on the continent. I think that Connolly has a kind of unique view in terms of his own participation, and not just the participation of the labour movement and the participation of the socialist movement in the struggle. So I think that's, I think he had a fantastic strategy and a fantastic vision. And of course, we can debate whether or not everything that he did was right and how would we go about it in the future. But I also think to do justice to Connolly, you actually have to look at what he was arguing, what he was writing, and what he actually did in terms of how he organised on the ground. And then we really get at the real Connolly in terms of where he was, what he was thinking from 1914 through to the Rising.
And of course, one of the tragedies of 1916 Rising is that Connolly's executed, so he misses that revolutionary period which follows the Rising, not just in Ireland, but the Bolshevik Revolution as well, which was in a lot of ways was put forward as being an extension or a continuation of that struggle for workers' control stretching back to the Paris Commune, which Connolly would have been fascinated by the fact the Bolsheviks making that connection because he was inspired himself by the Paris Commune, partly because of communards that were exiled here to the Cowgate. But he missed it also, we're coming up to the centenary of the First Oil, so that whole period in Ireland where it would be absolutely incredible to have Connolly's writings on that, and we miss that. But one of the crucial things in terms of Irish history since then has of course been the partition. And we're now sitting here discussing this in the context of Brexit, which means in Ireland, in the context of the partition of Ireland being again up for debate. What happened? Why is it there? Is it necessary? Do Irish people want to get rid of it? Do Irish people have the same rights people in Scotland had? A referendum to determine their own future without outside interference or impediment. So say a little bit about what Connolly thought about partition first and foremost, and then how is it playing out in Ireland for yourself, for your own perspective?
Well, and Connolly's writings on partition are very, very clear. I mean, he opposed it, and he thought it was an emergency to take action on, and he called for the labour movement to do everything possible to stop partition from happening, including bearing arms. And I think so a lot of people opposed partition at the time, and they thought it was an emergency, and they thought it would be a disaster for Irish self-determination. But again, I think when you read through Connolly, it's clear he has a particular argument about why he thinks partition will be a disaster and for whom it's going to be a disaster for. And he argues that he calls it a carnival. He says partition will lead to a carnival of reaction, north and south. And what did he mean by that? And I think his perspective was that the working class is the key social force to both end empire and to bring about a workers' republic. And that in the north, when he lived there, he worked towards bringing Catholic and Protestant workers together, even though that was difficult. But he said he thought it was necessary, and he believed that there was a strategy to do that. So to have the working classes, the working class of Ireland, because it was still one working class, even if there were differences in places like Belfast and elsewhere, to have that working class divided was going to weaken the struggle, to end empire, and it was going to weaken the struggle for socialism. So I think this is why Connolly was so alarmed at the prospect of partition. It would be a disaster for the working class movement. The working class movement would be cut off from each other and unable to build solidarity. And that, I think he understood that elites in the south, nationalist elites in the south, would be able to use Irish patriotism, and then of course, in the Free State, the Catholic Church was used as well. Catholicism was used to control the working classes, and explain to them why they needed to accept their lot. And of course, in the north, the Orange elites were able to beat the Orange drum to terrify Protestant workers that if they didn't stay united as a unionist people, they would end up in Rome rule, and also to demoralise and marginalise the Catholic population. So in the north, partition was a way of cementing the division between Catholic and Protestant workers. And so I think Connolly was absolutely right about how bad partition would be on the basic level of democracy, but also on the level of making it harder for the Irish working class to impose its demands, both north and south. And so we're still living with that legacy. And I think one of the great things that's happened in recent years, and I think this is why we should be very optimistic about the prospects for social change, is that we're seeing people in the south now who've lived with the legacy of partition, winning. Not just did we have the anti-austerity movement that brought out huge numbers of people in protest against the government, against Fianna Fáil and Fianna Gael, but we've had the struggle for LGBTQ marriage equality. We've now seen the repeal of the Eighth Amendment, so women are rising up across Ireland, and now we're seeing this housing movement where people are demanding social housing. But not just that, there is now the movement towards ending or separating church and state. So, maybe we've had to wait far too long for this, but there's clearly the population in the south is pushing for a more progressive, democratic, and a different kind of Ireland. And those things exist north of the border as well. I think that it's slower here because Stormont is such a dysfunctional institution because of the way in which the Good Friday Agreement, rather than challenging sectarianism, has actually reinforced it. And we're basically taught that there's two divided communities in the north and it's going to be like this forever. So the best we can hope for is the peace that we have. But I think what Brexit has done right now, and this should be for people who voted whatever way in the Brexit or in the EU referendum, there's no question that that Brexit inadvertently has opened up the question of not just a hard border, but the whole issue of partition. So, and I believe that it should be the case that if the people of Scotland can have the democratic right to vote on the issue of independence, the people of the north of Ireland and the people of all across Ireland should have the same democratic right. So I think in the coming years we should welcome and hope that we have the opportunity to have a challenge to partition. And I think the way that, and then I think the type of politics that Connolly argued are going to become very relevant, because if you think about what Connolly was arguing, he says, look, how are we going to win over Protestant workers to an independent Ireland? They're taught from a very young age this is something they should oppose. They're taught that they will be persecuted in a Catholic Ireland. How are we going to appeal to people who are frightened by potentially frightened by the project? And of course, it's not just the Protestant working class community, it's also the nationalist working class community or the increasing number of others. And I think Connolly's argument was that this is where an appeal to people on the basis of socialism actually makes a big difference, because we have to, if people are going to break from whatever their background is, which is, you think about how loud the orange drum can beat at times. If people are going to be able to break away from that, it means there has to be some expectation that people's lives will get better in a different kind of Ireland. And I think that that's going to be the key thing. Is the Ireland that we're fighting for now going to be an extension of the tax haven south, or is it going to be a different kind of Ireland where the needs of the vast majority of people come first, where we have an all-Ireland NHS, where women have the right to choose north and south, where it doesn't matter what your sexual orientation is, where migrants are treated justly and fairly, where our environment, north and south, is treated, is protected, defended. So I think that all those issues now, connecting the issue of social justice and equality is going to be crucial to how people think about why to end in partition.
And I think just to finish off the time we've got left, Shaun, I'm often fond of saying that Connolly's not just a figure for our past, he's a figure for our future, and that society needs to catch up with Connolly. And exactly what you're talking about there in terms of partition and the end of partition, but also if we think of all the problems and issues, political issues we have, like precarious work that you mentioned, the housing crisis which exists in Ireland and Scotland and other places, migration, all these issues are issues where Connolly has something very important to say. And I mean, just to finish off, how do you think that it's best at the moment to try and be inserting Connolly into these discussions? Because it is obviously in places like Ireland and Scotland that can be quite difficult to do. But he himself, I think, partly understood that, and he was writing songs and plays and any opportunity he could get to get the political message across. And I think maybe we need to try and look at the proletarian character of Connolly, which was essential in all the writings that you've got in the Reader. And we need to try and get back to that in terms of how the left approach some of these political problems. And Connolly's maybe a gateway into that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think why is Connolly going to be increasingly relevant? And I think that in times of turmoil, in times of social change, people look to people like Connolly or others that have written about how can our side win? What kind of strategies do we need to engage with or try in order to bring about upheaval, and what's the vision for a different kind of society? And of course, Connolly had a vision. It was buried for a long, long time, and that was about a socialist society, not just in Ireland. He had a global vision. He thought that the workers of the earth could live in harmony, and that we could have a kind of a new civilization, as he said, based on labour, respecting that everything that exists is the fruit of working class labour, but also based on justice and equality. So I think that obviously if people read Connolly and engage with him, or go and hear about Connolly, they can learn a little bit about his revolutionary politics. But I also think when we're building movements, what are the strategies and tactics that we're putting forward? And I think you don't necessarily need to know Connolly personally or to have read about him, but he believed that it was the working classes that would bring about social change. So how do we encourage working class people to mobilise? And I think that means taking up the same issues that Connolly did. And you mentioned it. Connolly took up issues of child welfare, housing, whether or not houses should have a garden for health purposes, wages, what the state's responsibility was in terms of pensions and so on. So it was very, very pragmatic and practical issues that are the key issues for working class people, and obviously linking them to bigger issues. But I think we have to, for those of us that looked at Connolly and are inspired by Connolly's vision, I think we have to be rooted in working class areas, rooted in the trade union movement, and then seeking to use the type of strategies that Connolly and Larkin and others used, which was, they understood that it was necessary to have mass mobilisations, necessary to have strike action. This was the only way to win, but it was also the type of strategies that gave working class people confidence in their own activity. Connolly famously said as well, he did stand for election unsuccessfully, as we know, quite a few times, and it would have been great if he had been elected, and I think he would have loved to have been elected. But he said, look, the role of a socialist who gets elected isn't to go in there and manage the system, it's to be a disturber of the political peace. And so I think that's what we need. We need to have that kind of spirit wherever we are. If you're in a trade union, if you're elected into Holyrood or the Dáil or Stormont, if you're a community activist, that's what we have to aim to be, disturbers of the political peace, encouraging other people to join the movement, and also laying out a bigger vision that people can aspire to, and then encouraging larger numbers of people to get involved in that struggle. And I think that given the turmoil that exists in the world, I think we're not going back anytime soon to some sort of normalcy where things are going to just automatically get better. So I think it's, there's some urgency right now to rebuilding a movement with the kind of politics and ideas that Connolly put forward.
Well, we certainly can't get enough James Connolly books, in my opinion, and we can't get enough Disturbers of the Political Peace. With that, Shaun, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening. Follow All Hail to the Pod on social media for updates. All Hail to the Pod is produced by Cowgate Media. For more information, visit 107cowgate.com.